So our study this morning then, this second session, is entitled The Mysterious, in fact the full title is The Mysterious Tale of Two Temples. Why does the spirit of Nimrod roam St. John Laterans? I hope that's sufficiently enigmatic to intrigue you and allow you to focus with intense concentration for this next hour. And by the way, this is perhaps a good illustration of why the framework of Bible prophecy helps us in terms of dealing now with different views and alternative ideas. If you just come for a moment to the 2nd of Thessalonians, which is really where this story is going to head to, you'll remember the famous chapter in the 2nd of Thessalonians about the man of sin. Now, let me just explain to you one of the alternative ideas that's sometimes promulgated concerning 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Because what it says in verse 3 of 2 Thessalonians 2 is, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." And what prompts this particular study is a view in the Brotherhood that has suggested that, well, the phrase the temple of God here is clearly a reference to the temple in Jerusalem. The temple of God was always in Jerusalem. And so what 2 Thessalonians is prophesying is that one day there will be another temple built by the Jews in Jerusalem, and the man of sin, whoever he is, will come and sit in that temple in the age to come in fulfillment of that prophecy. In fact, I've even heard a brother suggest that the Pope himself will come and sit in that temple in Jerusalem, because, well, that's where the temple of God is. There was never any other temple of God. You can't make St. Peter's the temple of God. It isn't. The temple in Jerusalem is the temple of God. It's used that way in the New Testament. So it's got to be in Jerusalem. So there's got to be another Jewish temple built. So the question is, brothers and sisters, well, how would you handle that, you see? Even if you felt that was wrong, how would you deal with that? And the answer is, well, we come back to the framework of Bible prophecy. And what you'll suddenly find is that the framework that we've now looked at becomes such a powerful and helpful means by which we can test other prophetic suggestions. Once we're happy that that framework is true, the question is, do other things fit on that framework or not? And by that means we can verify whether in fact they're valid or not. So let's do some investigation then and see how we might fit that onto the framework. So remember how we started our study in that first session. What's the great controversy? It's the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent down through time. That was the controversy that began in Genesis, that would still be there at the time of the end. And that controversy between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, you'll remember, was going to turn itself into Babylon versus Israel. And there would be a phase 1 in the Old Testament of that controversy and a phase 2 in the New Testament of that controversy. But it's all the same story down through time. So let's have a look then at how that might now work its way through in terms of the two rival systems, and in fact two rival temples. Well, come and have a look at Genesis chapter 9, which is the ancient prophecy of Noah. And Noah's prophecy says a couple of interesting things about his boys. It says this in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 25. "And he said, Cursed be Canaan." Now, Canaan, of course, is from the line of Ham. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, the servant of servants, shall he be unto his brethren," plural. By the way, I think there's something quite significant about that, because I think that the children of Ham were going to become servants to both Japheth and Shem, but for two different reasons and with two different results. The one would be the servitude of oppression as history unfolded. The other bit would be a service that would lead to redemption in Christ. And concerning Japheth, it says, verse 27, God shall enlarge Japheth. And so he would, because Japheth would be the son who would explore the world and colonize the world. But you notice what it says in verse 26 concerning Shem. It actually says in verse 26, blessed be the Lord God of Shem. It doesn't say blessed be Shem. Did you notice that? It says cursed be Canaan, or God shall enlarge Japheth, but it doesn't say blessed be Shem. It says blessed be Yahweh Elohim of Shem. So presumably what we're being told is that Shem is already in covenant relationship with God, and by blessing God, one by association blessed Shem, who clearly was in fellowship with God. He's the God of Shem, you see. And in fact, furthermore, it says, verse 27, God shall enlarge Japheth, and yet for all of that, says the record, verse 27, he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. Do you know, brothers and sisters, we believe that what that's saying is that for the Japhethites, and for that matter for the Hamites, the only way to God was through the tent of Shem. That's where the line of the seed of the woman would be found for the true worship of God. That's where the priest would be found, through whom God could be accessed. And any man of the line of Ham or of the line of Japheth could not of themselves come to God unless it be through the ministrations and through the priestly facility of the tent of Shem. And that's why what happens in the record becomes so interesting, brothers and sisters, because you'll remember that, well, if we come to Genesis chapter 10, remember we looked at that in our first study. It says concerning Nimrod in verse 8, Cush begat Nimrod, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before Yahweh. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babylon. And of course you'll remember that here was the beginning of that great rival system of things. In fact, you know what Nimrod's name means? Verse 8, Cush begat Nimrod. Nimrod's name means, we will rebel. And it was emblematic of the spirit of what Nimrod was about. We will rebel. And so he did. He rebelled from the seed of the woman. He rebelled from the system of worship that God had established and said, no, we're going to establish something quite different in the land of Shinar, in Babylon. We're going to establish a rival system. Well, so it is, because come over the page to Genesis chapter 11. You see, this is what it says. And by the way, this is the time of Nimrod, Genesis 11. It says in verse 2, it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar. And they dwelt there, and they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them throughly. And they had brick for stone and slime for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. Ooh, let me read verse 4 a little more carefully for you, brothers and sisters. Just feel the emphasis here. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad on the face of the whole earth. Ooh, do you see this? Do you see the emphasis? It's all about what we're going to do. It's about us. Do you notice that? And by the way, if you were to think of the two key words, verse 4, it's let us build and let us make. Let's build our city. Let's make our city and our name. And by the way, there's a marvelous contrast, you see, with that phrase in Genesis 11 and the faith of Abraham, who will be introduced in this chapter, because in Hebrews 11 it says of him, doesn't it, that he had a faith that would allow him to go to a different country, not knowing whither he went, for he looked for a city whose builder, let us build, and whose maker, let us make, is God, not men, God. And the city that Abraham wanted to go to, wanted to travel to, wanted to find was the city that God would make and the name that God would make, not that men would make. And verse 4, by the way, look at this. It says, they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name. Now, you'll probably know that in the Hebrew, the word Shem actually means name. The word Shem means name in the Hebrew. So when it said in Genesis 9, blessed be the Lord God of Shem, it really means blessed be the Lord God of the name. He who will be manifested in the mighty ones of the name. But you see, what the seed of the serpent did in the land of Shinar is they said, no, we don't want anything to do with Shem and with the system of worship that belongs to him. No, let's make our own Shem. Let's make our own name. Let's make our own system of worship. And we don't want the tent of Shem, Genesis chapter 9. No, we'll build our own temple, thank you. And by the way, that's what verse 4 is talking about when it says that they built a tower. Do you know that tower, brothers and sisters, was the ziggurat in Babylon. It was a religious tower. It was a religious temple. It's the temple for the meeting place of worship for the seed of the serpent. So the seed of the serpent in the days of Nimrod said, we don't want the tent of Shem and that system of worship. We want our own system, our own name, and our own temple. And the name of that temple, by the way, which Nimrod began to build, right here in Genesis chapter 11, we know that historically Nimrod was involved in the building of that very tower. And by the way, the remains of where it was are visible even by satellite today. It was a mysterious place, really. It was called Etemenenki, that tower that Nimrod built in Genesis 11. And it had 7 levels. And if you were to look at the length and the breadth and the height of that ziggurat, you'll find it was 92 meters by 92 meters by 92 meters. It was a set of mystical numbers. And those 7 levels, if you walk towards the ziggurat or the tower in Babylon that Nimrod established, at each level, starting at the bottom, there was a set of gates. And if your eye rose to the next level, you'd see another set of gates over the top of the first set of gates. And then again another set. And as you drew closer and closer and lifted your eyes higher and higher, you would see a succession of sets of gates. As if, brothers and sisters, this was the gate to heaven. That's exactly what they intended. It's exactly what the tower was about. It was like a staircase leading to heaven. In fact, the name Etemenenki means the house of the foundation of heaven on earth. And what Nimrod built was a system, you see, that would allow men to communicate with the gods. It was a rival system to the tent of Shem, begun in Babylon, you see. And that temple was dedicated to Merodach and his consort queen. At the very top of the temple there was a shrine where only the king priest could enter, and his wife, who we believe were none other than Nimrod and Semiramis. And so what we're being told here in the very early days, a very early stage of things, Genesis 11, is that by this stage the seed of the serpent have already got a city and a tower. And in that ziggurat there was a king priest, and that Nimrod was the founder of a rival system of worship and of the original rival temple, the first rival temple to the seed of the woman. And of course, by the way, the seed of the woman, well, let's come and have a look at it. Genesis chapter 14. Because you see what it says concerning Melchizedek. It says in Melchizedek's day in Genesis chapter 14, it simply says, verse 18, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him, saying, blessed be Abraham, the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. You know, it's a strange thing, but Genesis 14 doesn't say anything about a tower or a building. Did you notice that? There's no great tower in Salem. There is a tower in Babylon. There's a magnificent temple of worship in Babylon. Already, brothers and sisters, not so in Salem. What's in Salem? Just a tent. Just the tent of Shem. But in that tent, brothers and sisters, one could find God. And that's so because if you have a look at this next passage here, you'll find that in Psalm 76 and verse 2, we're given the only other time, actually, in the Bible that the word Salem is used. Found in Genesis, in the story of Melchizedek. It's found in one other place only, in Psalm 76. And this is what Psalm 76 says, verse 1. Set in the days of Hezekiah, in Judah is God known, his name is great in Israel. In Salem also is his tent, says Psalm 76. In Salem is his tent. And you see, that's the whole point, is that there was a king priest that revealed himself in that place. But he wasn't in the temple, not yet. He was in the tent. But it happened to be the tent of meeting, in which God would be found by the ministrations of the king priest in that place. So now we've got, brothers and sisters, we've got two king priests in two rival cities, one in a temple, one in a tabernacle, and the same controversy going on between those two places of meeting and worship, as of course we know. And in fact, the one temple, as it were, excited the enmity of the worshippers of the other. And so it would be down through time. In fact, come and have a look at 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Because later on, in the history of the nation, we're told this, in the days of the giving up of Israel into captivity, the record puts it this way. And somehow when you read these words, and you think about this rivalry, well, it suddenly becomes rather clear in terms of the framework of Bible prophecy and what's going on here. We're told in the 2nd of Chronicles, chapter 36, verse 14, it says, moreover, the chief of the priests and the people transgressed very much after all the abominations of the heathen, and polluted the house of Yahweh, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. And so God sent messengers to them, but they mocked the messengers of God. And so finally, verse 17 says this, therefore he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees. The king of the Chaldees, that's the rival place, isn't it? That's Babylon. And what did he do? He slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. He had no compassion upon young men or maiden, old man or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of Yahweh, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, and brake down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all the palaces thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. And so what happens is Nebuchadnezzar comes down, brothers and sisters, as the champion of the temple of Babylon, and burns the temple in Salem. Can you feel that controversy? He comes down as the champion of the temple in Babylon and burns the temple in Salem. And what does he do? Verse 19, he takes back the vessels of God's house. Takes the vessels of God's house. So where did he take them to? Well, we're told in Daniel chapter 1. Come and have a look at this. Daniel chapter 1. We're told what happened when Nebuchadnezzar returned to the land of Shinar. It says this in Daniel chapter 1. Just feel this sense of controversy between the two temples. Verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Can you see the two temples there? He brought the vessels from the house of God in Jerusalem, and he brought them into the house of his God. That's the other God. That's the other system, isn't it? In Babylon. Oh, but he didn't say Babylon. He said, in the land of Shinar. Now, where does that take us back to, brothers and sisters? You see, that phrase, the land of Shinar, transports us all the way back to Genesis 11. And in the land of Shinar, they built a tower. This is the old Nimrodian temple. This is Nimrod's tower, all the way back in Genesis chapter 11. And what we're being told in Daniel chapter 1 is there's still a rival temple in Shinar. In fact, brothers and sisters, it's the same building. The very temple that Nebuchadnezzar worshipped in was the very building begun by Nimrod. There's a continuum of the story of the seed of the serpent here, and of that rival temple that existed not only in the days of Nimrod at the start of this story, but now we've come even to Nebuchadnezzar, and he brings the vessels of the house of God back into that very temple in Babylon, in the land of Shinar, says the record. And you see, the Spirit would bid us hear a Bible echo that takes us all the way back to the story of Genesis chapter 11 with that phrase. Come and have a look at chapter 5 of Daniel. Do you remember this? The feast of Belshazzar. Now, just read these words and think about this in the context of this great controversy that we've been looking at. In Daniel chapter 5, verse 1, it says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. And Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father, actually his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank in them. And they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron and of wood and of stone. And you see, what we are being told is that the drinking of those vessels symbolized the triumph of one temple over the other, did it not? He called for those vessels to be brought forth, that the triumph of his temple in Babylon might be seen over the temple in Jerusalem. Just stop and think about Daniel chapter 5, brothers and sisters. Do you know that Babylon had conquered many nations? Babylon had unbelievable treasures from all over the world, from the empire that Babylon had amassed under its control and under its jurisdiction. They had unbelievable treasures from all different parts. Yet the one thing that Belshazzar asked for of all things in his realm that might be brought forth on the day of that feast was the vessels of God's house in Jerusalem. Ooh, isn't that interesting? The one thing he asked to have brought forth. The one thing. And in fact, the drinking out of those vessels marked the doom of that king, brothers and sisters, that he should do such a thing. In fact, have a look at this. Come back to Ezra chapter 5 and see how that story is actually worked out in the Chronicles of the return of the Jewish people. He asked for those vessels, the only thing he asked for, and he drank out of them to symbolize the supremacy of his temple over God's temple. But it wasn't to be, because this is what Ezra chapter 5 says. Ezra 5 says, maybe verse 12 for connection, says this. It says, but after that our fathers had provoked the God of heaven unto wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried the people away into Babylon. But in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Babylon, the same King Cyrus made a decree to build this house of God. And the vessels also of gold and silver of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was in Jerusalem and brought them into the temple of Babylon, these did Cyrus the king take out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered unto one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he'd made the governor. And he said unto him, take these vessels and go and carry them into the temple that's in Jerusalem. Let the house of God be builded in his place. Always got to read the Bible carefully, brothers and sisters. Did you see the rivalry there? Let me put it up for you. So you see the critical words. See, what Ezra says is that the vessels also of gold and silver of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that was in Jerusalem and brought them into the temple that was in Babylon. Now Cyrus asks for those same vessels to be taken out of the temple that was in Babylon and delivers them to Sheshbazzar that they might be carried into the temple that's in Jerusalem. See the rivalry there? The one temple versus the other temple. The one priest versus the other priest. The one champion versus the other champion. The one system versus the other system. The story of the rivalry of the temples, brothers and sisters, is all part of this ancient conflict, isn't it, down through time. Even the temples are rivals, as Ezra would bid us see. In fact, have a look at this in Jeremiah chapter 51. So much so is that a rivalry that extends even to the places of worship which were built by the two seeds, that the Bible says this in the book of Jeremiah in chapter 51. It puts it this way in verse 11. Make bright the arrows, gather the shields. Yahweh hath raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his device is against Babylon to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of Yahweh, the vengeance of his temple, it says in Jeremiah 51. The vengeance of his temple. This controversy is the controversy of God's temple, it says. This controversy between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And what Jeremiah 51 is telling us is that God takes everything into account. And when Nebuchadnezzar burnt the temple of God with fire, God wasn't unmindful of what he'd done. And when the vessels of God's house were taken to the temple of the land of Shinar, God wasn't unmindful of what had been done. And everything would be visited back upon the temple of Nimrod by means of the judgments of God in due course, until finally the very temple of Nimrod, that temple called Temenenki, would finally be destroyed in the purpose of God. And that really brings us to Zechariah chapter 5, which you'll remember we alluded to in our last study. But just come have a look at this, because it's quite an interesting little prophecy. It says this in Zechariah chapter 5. I just want you to notice some key words as we go through this prophecy. Zechariah 5, verse 5. Says, Then the angel that talked with me went forth and said unto me, Lift up now thine eyes and see what it is. What is this that goeth forth? And I said, What is it? And he said, It's an ephah that goeth forth. And he said, Moreover, this is their resemblance through all the earth. Now, by the way, that word resemblance, the Revised Standard Version translates as iniquity. This is their iniquity through all the earth. And the Revised Standard Version is following the Septuagint translation, which actually translates the word as sin. This is their sin through all the earth. I want you just to make a note of that word. This is their iniquity, says the Revised Standard Version. This is their iniquity. And now verse 7. Behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead, and this is a woman that sitteth in the midst of the ephah. Oh, did you notice that second word? Take a note of it, sitteth. This is a woman that sitteth in the midst of the ephah. So the word iniquity, verse 6, or resemblance, and the word sitteth, verse 7. Well, here's another key word, verse 8. And he said, he looked at the woman and he said, this is wickedness. This is wickedness. Now take a note of that word. She's a wicked woman. So he cast her into the midst of the ephah and cast the weight of lead upon the mouth thereof. And I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, there came out two women. And the wind was in their wings, for they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between the earth and the heaven. And I said to the angel that talked with me, Whither do these bear the ephah? And he said unto me, to build it an house in the land, or let me just read that more carefully, verse 11, and reading from the Revised Version, to build her an house in the land of Shinar, and she shall be established and set there upon her own base. Where is this woman flying? Well, she's flying to another place, says the prophet, that she might have a house built for her in another land of Shinar. Now, by the way, this prophecy concerning the woman and the stalks was given to Zechariah around about BC 510. And the actual city of Babylon had fallen to Cyrus about 20 years before this, BC 539. About 200 years after this prophecy, 510, about 200 years later, you remember that Alexander came into Babylon. And in fact, what he was intending to do was going to rebuild the Tower of Nimrod. Alexander says, I think we'll rebuild the Tower of Nimrod, but to start with, what we'll do is we'll clear the site before we build. So under the orders of Alexander, they took the ziggurat, or what was left of it, they took it to pieces, stone by stone and brick by brick, and they cleared the whole of the building site. About 200 years after this prophecy, they literally took the temple of Nimrod, the Tower of Babel, apart piece by piece and stone by stone till there was nothing left, just a bare platform. And the trouble was that at that crucial moment, Alexander died. And they never did build the temple again in the land of Nimrod, the Tower of Shinar. Never did. It's never been built since. Never been another building on that spot ever again. And as I said, you can actually see a satellite photo now that will show you the empty site. And yet the prophecy says, Zechariah 5, that the woman was going to be taken somewhere and a new house built for her. And of course the answer is that this prophecy is about the building of a new house, another temple in the mystical land of Shinar. And the house of verse 11 is going to be the house or the temple where the woman lives whose name is wickedness. The old temple was going to be superseded, but another place would be provided for the woman to sit and a house for her to dwell in another land of Shinar. It wasn't Babylon literal, but it was somewhere else. Now that brings us, you see, to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So now, that was a long-winded introduction to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, wasn't it? But now we finally got there, brothers and sisters, back to the prophecy that we started with, and this alternative view as to what it might mean about where the temple is that the man of sin sits in. And I hope what we've seen as we've come down through the study thus far is to realize that the story of the two seeds is the answer to the puzzle. There's always been two seeds, but there's actually always been two temples. Ever since the days of Nimrod, there's been two temples. Now, I want you to notice some key words here. So, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3, reading again, it says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first." Now, some of you may know that the word falling away in 2 Thessalonians is the word for apostasy. There's going to be an apostasy from the truth into a different form of religion. And the interesting thing about that word apostasy that's used in 2 Thessalonians is that in other Greek manuscripts outside of the Bible, that word is used for a rebellion. It's used to describe a rebellion led by a rebel. But do you remember the meaning of Nimrod's name? Nimrod's name meant we will rebel. Who was the first rebel? Why, Nimrod. Who do you think the last rebel is going to be? Why, the man of sin, says 2 Thessalonians. He's Nimrod's successor. Now, I want you to notice some key words here in Thessalonians. So, verse 4, he opposes and exalts himself above all that's called God or worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple. Sitteth. Now, where did that come from? And behold, a woman sitting, it said. Do you remember that in the book of Zechariah, chapter 5? A woman sitting. And here is a man. He is a man now, not a woman, notice. A man sitting in a temple, but he sits there. And apparently it's important that we should know that. Why would we need to know that he sits? Well, we shall see by and by, brothers and sisters, how important it is that that be drawn to our attention. And not only that, but verse 7 goes on to say, for the mystery of iniquity doth already work. But you see, when the woman in the ephah was first seen, Zechariah said, this is their iniquity through all the earth. And now Thessalonians says the mystery of iniquity already works. And you remember when he first saw the woman in the ephah, what did the man say to Zechariah? He looked at the woman, he said, this is wickedness. And you see what Thessalonians says, verse 8, and then shall that wicked be revealed. Oh, yes, I think what we're being told, brothers and sisters, is that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is a companion prophecy to Zechariah chapter 5. This is the man sitting in the mysterious house that will be built for the woman in another land of Shinar. And he's going to exalt himself as a king, but sit in a temple as a priest. He's a king and he's a priest, after the order of Nimrod of Old Testament times. Now, one of the interesting things about the man of sin is this. Verse 7 says that the mystery of iniquity that will usher in the man of sin is already at work. Only he who now withholds or letteth or restrains will continue to do so until he's taken out of the way. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume. You know one of the strange things about Thessalonians? It says this, brothers and sisters. Look at my hands. It says the man of sin is going to appear shortly after the Apostles' Day. Mystery of iniquity is already at work. The man of sin soon shall appear. And yet the funny thing about Thessalonians, it says that when the Lord comes, he'll destroy the man of sin. Funny thing. So how long was this man going to live for? This man who was shortly to appear after the days of the apostles, yet will still be alive when Christ comes to be destroyed. The man of sin must live for centuries. And of course the answer is, well, no ordinary man could live for centuries, could they? But a succession of men could, who all sit in the same temple and who all claim to be the man of sin, and who all are the rival system of the Nimrodian Babylonian system of religious worship, a succession of men who all succeed one after the other to the same office of king priest. Well, let me show you what happened, because it's absolutely remarkable, brothers and sisters, what actually happened. You know, one of the great things about Thessalonians is it says, you've got to figure this out, you've got to work this out, you see, verse 6. And now you know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. There was something holding back the man of sin appearing. Now the question is, the burning question of 2 Thessalonians is, well, what was holding him back? Well, I know what the early believers believed, brothers and sisters. He who now letteth. What did they think that was? And by the way, any proper interpretation of Thessalonians has got to explain that, you see. He who now letteth, he who restrains. When he's gone, whoever he is, or whoever that is, then the man of sin shall appear. So we want to know, well, who was that power that lettered or restrained or withheld the man of sin from appearing? Well, here's the testimony of the early writers. Irenaeus was a disciple of John. Actually, a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So AD 185. When did John receive the book of Revelation, approximately? Anyone remember? About AD 96. Yes, I go for the 96 date. So therefore, this is less than 100 years later on, not too far after John. This is what he said. Daniel 2, looking forward to the end of the last kingdom, the 10 kings who shall then arise, amongst whom the kingdom of those men shall be partitioned, and upon whom the son of perdition shall come. But you see, that phrase, son of perdition, is out of 2 Thessalonians, chapter 2, isn't it? verse 3. So when would the son of perdition come? When the 10 kings arise upon the Roman beast of Daniel 7. Then we will see the son of perdition. That's what they believed once the 10 kingdoms had come. And again, Tertullian, writing in AD 190, says, "Only let him hold fast, who now rules, until he's out of the way, who can only be the Roman state, whose breaking apart and dispersal among 10 kings will produce the Antichrist, and then will the evil one be revealed." That wicked one shall be revealed. So when did the early believers, brothers and sisters, believe that the man of sin would be revealed? When the Roman state was taken out of the way. The pagan Roman state, by the way. Now, here's some more writers. Again, Tertullian says, "There is another great necessity of praying for the emperors, even for the stability of the entire empire and for the affairs of the Roman state, because the greatest force threatening the whole world and threatening horrible calamities at the very end of the age we know to be delayed by the continued existence of the Roman Empire. Therefore we are unwilling to put it to the test, which is why we pray for the delay of the Antichrist by favouring the permanence of the Romans." Shall I just translate that for you? Just stop and think about how powerful that is. Do you know that the early believers were persecuted by pagan Rome? Persecuted by pagan Rome. But what we're being told here is that those same believers prayed that pagan Rome might stay. That pagan Rome might continue, even though they were persecuted by pagan Rome. Why? Because they believed that the moment pagan Rome was gone, something far more horrible was going to turn up, the man of sin. And that's the one thing they didn't want. They said, we'd rather continue to be persecuted by paganism of Rome than for the man of sin to appear. We'll pray for the pagan Roman emperors that they might continue by the grace of God. That's what they believed. They believed that that was the great power that was restraining the influence or the manifestation of the man of sin was being held back by none other than paganism. Again, Cyril of Jerusalem says, "Moreover, the Antichrist was prophesied to come when the times of the Roman Empire have been completed." And lastly, John Chrysostom says, "He who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way. That is, when the Roman Empire is taken out of the way, then he shall come. And naturally, for as long as the fear of this empire lasts, no one will readily exalt himself." That comes from 2 Thessalonians 2. But when that is dissolved, when the Roman Empire is dissolved, he will attack the anarchy and endeavour to seize upon the government both of men and of God. So question, brothers and sisters, an historical question. Who destroyed pagan Rome? And when did he do it? Any thoughts? You're quite right, by the way. Definitely Constantine. Well, there was a famous date. There was a famous date. One of the great battles of Constantine. So let me give you that. So you see, one of the questions is, actually I've jumped the gun here. So where is the temple of the man of sin? Let's just summarise what we've said. The man of sin is part of the continuum of the rival power of the seed of the serpent, which since Nimrod has had a rival temple. And also the man of sin is a development of the prophecy of the woman called wickedness, who has a house built for her in the land of Shinar, says Zechariah chapter 5. And the man of sin is parallel to the little horn of Daniel 7 and the false prophet of Revelation 19. And both those chaps live in Europe. So if they both live in Europe, then we'd expect the man of sin to have his basilica somewhere in Europe, because that's where they are. So let me show you just how remarkably that actually turned out in terms of the history of the times. So you're quite right. The man of sin was going to be revealed when the restraining power was removed. And it would be removed by Constantine, we believe. And so this question of taking his seat in the temple of God isn't going to happen at some mysterious time in the future when the Jews rebuild another temple. If the man of sin has been alive for centuries, then he's already been in the temple, hasn't he? Because Thessalonians says that as soon as the man of sin is revealed, he'll be seen in a temple. That's how you'll know that he's the man of sin. You'll see him in a temple as soon as the restraining power has been removed. So let me show you just how dramatically 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 was in fact fulfilled in the history of the time. Well, it was AD 312, the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And pagan Rome was overthrown by Constantine. And he who now letteth, pagan Rome, was taken out of the way. Of course, Constantine had a dream, didn't he? Remember, he dreamed a dream. He saw a vision. In the sign of the cross thou shalt conquer. He went forth and he marched into battle. He won a signal victory. Now, by the way, he was fighting against the Roman emperor of the day, whose name was Maxentius. Maxentius went forth to battle against Constantine, but Constantine won. So that's the year that he who now letteth was taken out of the way. Now, what did let me just untangle my lips there. What did Thessalonians say? As soon as he who lets is taken out of the way, what will we see? The man of sin, where? Sitting in his temple. Now, just watch this, brothers and sisters. Ooh, this is remarkable. So what happened was this. What Constantine did immediately after that battle is he donated the Lateran Palace on Monticello and the adjoining land of the imperial horse guard, known as Campus Lateranensis, to the Bishop of Rome, Melchiades, who took possession of the palace basilica. So what happened was this. There was a palace called the Lateran. And as soon as the battle was over, Constantine went to the Bishop of Rome. He said, look, would you like this little palace? Quite nice. It's got a little church in it. It's got a little temple. It's got a little basilica in it. Would you like to sit here? And of course, Melchiades said, it'll be very nice, thanks very much. Now, by the way, what happened was, right next door to that little temple, that basilica, was a big piece of land that was the actual barracks of the imperial horse guard, as it says there. Now, the imperial horse guard was 2,000 of the most fierce soldiers in the Roman Empire. They were great warriors. But they made a bad mistake. Because in this particular battle, unfortunately, they decided to support Maxentius instead of Constantine. And Constantine won. So the first thing he did is he gave the Lateran Palace with its little temple, its little basilica, to the Bishop of Rome. And then he said, would you like this block of land next door? Because what I'm about to do is I'm about to destroy the barracks of the Imperial Horse Guard as a punishment for not supporting me. And that's what he did, demolished the lot. Now he said, there's a good big piece of land here. He said, now look, you might like to do something with this block of land, to the Bishop of Rome. In the very next year, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan to grant freedom of religion to Christianity. You see, he who restrains had been taken out of the way. Christianity was about to become state religion within a year of the battle. But by that stage, there was already a man of sin sitting in a little temple, you see. In fact, what we're told is that in the very next year, the church synod convened for the first time in the Lateran Palace to resolve the problem of what was called the Donatist Schism. So there was not sure what you call a gathering of cardinals. You have a pride of lions and a gaggle of geese. So maybe a cluster of cardinals. So the cluster of cardinals met for the first time in the Lateran Palace to debate a church matter. The very piece that Constantine had given them just the year before in the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Now what's interesting about that palace is this. Is that palace became the official seat and residence for the popes for the next 1,000 years. Isn't that remarkable? For 1,000 years they lived in that house. Oh, and what about the bit of land next door? Well, that was quite useful because what they did is they began to construct a new basilica on Campus Lateranensis next to the Lateran Palace. And it didn't take very long, actually. It only took about 12 years when they first got the land, because in AD 324, the new basilica was completed and dedicated by the next Bishop of Rome, whose name was Sylvester. And when he dedicated it, he declared both the basilica and the palace to be Domus Dei, the temple of God, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And within 12 years of the removal of pagan Rome, there was a man of sin sitting in a brand new temple right in that spot, St. John Lateran's. That was the beginning of that church. You might not know a lot about St. John Lateran's. Let me just tell you one or two interesting facts about St. John Lateran's. You tend to think about St. Peter's, don't you? Always focus on St. Peter's. But I think the key to the secret is St. John Lateran's, because you see that St. John Lateran's, well, that basilica is the cathedral of the Roman diocese and is therefore the Pope's own cathedral. When the new Pope was appointed and elected in 2005, shortly after his election, it says, well, he's gone to take possession of his own cathedral, which was not St. Peter's but St. John Lateran's. It's the oldest Christian temple and therefore ranks first among the 5 basilicas of Rome. St. John Lateran's ranks above St. Peter's in terms of its primacy and importance amongst the temples of Rome, the temples of Babylon, we might call it, in Rome. A whole set of them now. And if you were to go into that temple, the bronze central doors at the opening of the church are taken from the Roman Forum where the Senate met. So if you ever wanted to think about whether the Catholic Church is a continuum of the Roman system, well, here it is. They've got the doors of the Senate on the front of the church, as if to say, well, the Senate is where the empire used to make its decisions, but they're made right here in this temple now. Thank you very much. So they borrowed the same doors, you see. In fact, if you go into the middle of that St. John Lateran's, the very central point is what's called the cathedra. And it's from that seat where the Roman pontiff makes his pronouncements. In fact, let me show you that. It's quite interesting. So here it is. So you see that chair right at the back? That's the seat of the pontiff. It's on 6 steps. You rise up 6 steps to a chair right at the back of St. John Lateran's. And that's where the Pope would, quote, take his seat. That's exactly what Thessalonians says. He takes his seat in the temple. And the reason why that's so significant is when the Pope sat on that seat, he would make from the chair infallible pronouncements on behalf of the church. That seat, that chair, was the very symbol of his authority over the whole of the system of Rome and of Babylon when he sat on that seat at the back of St. John Lateran's. Now, can you go up the top, brothers and sisters? Can you go right to the top of the dome? Can you see right at the very top of the dome a face just by itself in the middle? Can you see that face? Of course, by the way, you do realise that this building has been burnt down and demolished and destroyed and rebuilt 5 times since the time of Constantine. So St. John Lateran's that you go to today isn't the actual building that was built in the days of Constantine. But if you go to the top, you see that little face at the top. Can you see it there? Splendid. Let me blow that up for you. So there it is. That face is a mosaic of Christ. Now, what is interesting about that face is that mosaic goes right back to the day of Constantine when that temple was first dedicated in AD 324. It's been there ever since, brothers and sisters. Even though the building's been rebuilt, that mosaic's always been preserved. Now, you stop and think about this. It's almost spooky because you see that mosaic, that face, has looked down upon every man of sin who's ever sat upon that seat from the time of Constantine onwards. And that's what Thessalonians said. The mystery of iniquity is already at work and it'll still be there when Christ comes to destroy it at the time of the end. And there's been a succession of men of sin. That mosaic's looked down on every one of them. What's the lot of them when they've taken their seat in that place? Isn't that interesting? And here's another interesting thing, is that next to the basilica is a place called the Scala Sancta. And the Scala Sancta, also known as the Scala Palati, is the holy staircase, called holy because it said that Constantine's mother shipped the whole of Pilate's staircase from the Praetorian Guard in Jerusalem, stone by stone, to Rome and rebuilt it there. When you go up those stairs, you're not allowed to tread on your feet. You've got to go up on your knees. You can only shuffle up on your knees because it's considered to be a holy staircase. And when you get to the top, the very top, brothers and sisters, you just see a grate, a grill, and beyond the grill, a murky, mysterious, dark place beyond. And over the top of that grill it says, in Latin, "There is no place holier than this." And that place is called the Sancta Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies. It's the most venerated place in Rome because it's the Pope's private chapel where he alone can go and pray. And I've got a booklet on St. John Laterans, collected at St. John Laterans, that says that when you go into that most holy place where the Pope prays alone, that there's ancient relics there. In fact, you know what the booklet said? It said there's ancient relics there just like there were in the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, says the booklet. It's a rival system to God's temple, always has been. And just like the priest in Israel could only go into the most holy place once a year, so the Temple of Babylon has a holy place where only the priest can go in, the Pope alone. Do you know who the first priest was that could alone go into the room on top of the tower? Why, Nimrod, brothers and sisters, in Genesis chapter 11, there was a room where only he could go as the king priest of the mysteries. It's all come down through time. The spirit of Nimrod, I declare, roams St. John Laterans even today, brothers and sisters. It's an amazing way in which that particular prophecy was fulfilled, starting so long ago. And that really brings us to Zechariah chapter 6. Because Zechariah 6 says, Zechariah 6 says there's going to be another temple to replace the one in Jerusalem, does it not? Verse 11 of Zechariah 6 says, "Take silver and gold and make crowns and set them upon the head of Joshua the son of Josedech the high priest, and speak unto him, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, Behold is the man whose name is the branch, and he shall grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord." And there it is, brothers and sisters. It's not the Jews that are going to rebuild it. It's not the man of sin that's going to rebuild it. It's the branch that builds the temple in Jerusalem at the time of the end in the future. And verse 13 says, "And he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory, and he shall sit and rule upon his throne." That means he's a king. "And he shall be a priest upon his throne." That makes him a priest. "And the council of peace, the council of Salem, the council of Shalom, shall be between them both." And when that temple is built, brothers and sisters, the true king priest will be back on the earth, and a true system of worship will be established. And that building in Jerusalem will be the centre of the world. You know, across the front of St. John Laterans is incised these words in the stone: "Sacrosancta Lateranensis Ecclesia omnium urbis et orbis ecclesiarum mater ecaput," which being translated means from the Latin, "Most Holy Lateran Church of all churches in the city and the world, the mother and the head." But the true temple, brothers and sisters, that will be the head of all the worship of the world, will be this one in Jerusalem that we see here prophesied in Zechariah chapter 6. So let's end the story there, shall we, for purposes of our study now. And notice how our framework of Bible prophecy enables us to see the wisdom and the balance of how that story has outworked in keeping with God's framework.